He was merely an identification. Lot number 47, lame, quiet, and overlooked. He occupied a space in the corner of an auction yard, anticipating the world's final abandonment. However, when a reserved man entered and his gaze met that of the damaged German shepherd, an unvoiced understanding occurred between them. Two spirits, fractured by conflict and bereavement, were on the verge of unknowingly altering one another's existence. An act initiated as a rescue would evolve into an odyssey of mending, concealed truths, and a connection so profound it would stir the globe. The atmosphere within the auction yard carried the scent of dust, corroded metal, and an element significantly more oppressive: desertion under the discolored metallic covering. Sounds reverberated as muted whispers, interrupted by the piercing clang of enclosures and the vacant cries of apathetic bidders. In the most distant recess, faintly illuminated by an unsteady light bulb, a German shepherd was seated. He emitted no barks. He did not move restlessly like the other animals. He was simply motionless. Identification tag number 47 dangled from his enclosure. His coat was tangled. A scar divided his left ear, and he possessed a subtle lameness in his rear leg that he attempted, unsuccessfully, to conceal. His ribs were visible beneath his fur, and his eyes, they did not survey the area. They did not implore. They merely gazed downwards, as though he had already resigned himself to the fact that no one would arrive. He had ceased to hope. The majority of individuals passed his enclosure without affording him a second look. A few chuckled at his dilapidated appearance. Others shook their heads and proceeded, concentrating on younger canines or breeds prepared for exhibition. The auctioneer scarcely presented him, merely an identification, merely a liability. It was at that moment Eli entered the structure. Aged 30, his sleeves were rolled above his weathered forearms, his hands stained with grease from retrieving components at a local scrapyard. His presence there was unplanned. He no longer frequented such locations. Not for some time. Yet, on this day, an unknown force had pulled him there. He stopped at the entrance, surveying the barn before his gaze rested on the shepherd. Initially, Eli remained still. Then the dog, without raising its head, gradually looked upwards. And for a fleeting instant, something wavered. Not a glimmer of optimism. Not yet, but a shared understanding. Suffering. Acknowledging suffering. A constriction formed in Eli's chest. He was uncertain of the cause. Perhaps it was the quietness in the dog's eyes that mirrored his own. Perhaps it was the shepherd's refusal to implore, not even with a faint cry. He simply awaited whatever destiny held. The auctioneer's voice announced again, tonelessly, Lot 47, injured male. No history available. Do I hear 20? Stillness. Eli's hand rose before he consciously decided. The auctioneer blinked. 20 going once. Going twice. No other bids were made. Not a single one. Sold to the reserved man at the rear. There was no round of applause. No words of congratulation. Just the sound of a pen scratching on a clipboard and a receipt exchanged without meeting eyes. Eli moved forward, unlatching the gate with unsteady hands. The shepherd remained still, did not growl, did not even recoil. He rose slowly, limping somewhat, and trailed Eli out as if they had made this journey before, in some other existence. Outside, the wind intensified. Dust eddied around their feet as Eli opened the passenger door of his truck. The dog paused for only a brief moment before entering and settling on the floor. Eli took his seat behind the steering wheel but did not immediately start the vehicle. He glanced at the dog, questioning what he had just done. He hadn't intended to rescue anything. And yet, somehow, as the engine finally sputtered to life, it seemed he wasn't the one performing the rescue. He was the one being saved. The truck departed the gravel lot, its frame groaning with age and the burden of something more substantial than corroded components or worn-out tires. Inside, neither human nor canine uttered a sound. Eli maintained a loose grip on the steering wheel with one hand, the other resting near the gear lever, occasionally casting brief glances towards the passenger side floor. The German shepherd lay curled up compactly, not sleeping, not at ease, just still. Each jolt from the uneven road caused his body to tense. Every gust of wind seemed to make his ears flatten. But he did not look at Eli. Not even once. The road extended vacant beneath a pale sky. Eli had consistently found solace in driving, the drone of the engine, the way the scenery passed by in silence. Today, however, a heaviness permeated the air. Not regret, not precisely, but something akin to it. He hadn't intended to bring a dog home, particularly not one with shadows in its eyes. Yet, he couldn't dismiss the sensation that this wasn't a chance occurrence, that perhaps, in some way, they were destined to encounter each other. He attempted to speak, more to himself than to the dog. "You have a name?" The shepherd remained motionless. "Figured not." Eli sighed, scratching his chin. "What about Buddy?" "Max?" "Scout?" "Nothing." He paused, then ventured one more name, one he hadn't articulated aloud for years. "Shadow." At that sound, the dog's ears twitched, subtly but perceptibly enough to make Eli freeze. It was faint, like a phantom brushing against him. He whispered it once more. "Shadow." The dog lifted his head slightly, just enough to glance in Eli's direction. A single, fleeting moment, and then it was gone, but something within Eli fractured. A recollection, the aroma of sand and fire, the din of gunfire, and the weight of a different dog, his dog, pressed against him, bleeding, trembling, remaining with him until the medics came. That was years prior. That dog never returned home. But the name persisted inside Eli like a scar. By the time they arrived at his property, an old, creaking house situated at the edge of a depleted field, Eli felt a profound exhaustion he couldn't articulate. He parked, exited the vehicle, and opened the passenger door. "Come on." The shepherd hesitated, then slowly rose. He didn't jump out. He didn't sniff around with curiosity. He merely stepped down as if complying with a long-forgotten directive. Eli guided him to the porch, opened the screen door, and gestured inwards. The dog entered without a sound. Not once did his tail wag. Not once did he bark. He simply walked into the unfamiliar dwelling as if he had done so 1,000 times before. Inside, Eli took a towel and gently cleaned the dog's paws. They were cracked and sore. The shepherd didn't struggle, didn't wince, just stared at the floor. Eli spread an old blanket beside the hearth, poured water into a dish, and opened a tin of dog food. The shepherd sniffed it but did not consume it. Instead, he curled into himself on the blanket and shut his eyes, as if the world behind them was too overwhelming to recall. That night, Eli slept on the sofa across the room. He couldn't dispel the image of that limp, that scar. He couldn't forget the twitch of those ears when he uttered the name Shadow. Sleep arrived in fragmented pieces, interrupted by memories that struck like explosions, shouting, blasts, blood, sand. Around 3 a.m., Eli awoke with a sudden gasp, sweat clinging to his skin. He looked over. The shepherd was sitting upright, his eyes fixed on Eli from the other side of the room. No words were exchanged, but in that quietude, something passed between them. They both understood the burden of nightmares, and for the first time in years, Eli didn't feel utterly alone in the darkness. The subsequent days unfolded like a mist, slow, silent, oppressive. The German shepherd seldom ventured from the front porch. He would recline on the aged wooden planks, head resting on his paws, eyes fixed on the tree line, motionless even when birds flitted through the branches or vehicles passing on the distant road stirred up dust. He remained there, steadfast, like a sentinel caught between recollection and instinct. Eli observed him from the kitchen window, coffee cup in hand, uncertain whether the dog was safeguarding something or awaiting something's return. Eli attempted various methods to elicit a response. Toys, treats, even extended walks through the woods behind his dwelling. But the dog showed no interest in play. He did not bark. He didn't even investigate his surroundings with sniffs as most dogs would. He moved with a practiced discipline, navigating corners before Eli did, pausing near doorways as if securing rooms, constantly observing the horizon. Whatever history this dog carried, it had not released its hold on him, and perhaps it never would. The old collar still hung loosely about his neck. Faded leather, frayed edges. One evening, curiosity overcame Eli. He sat on the porch beside the dog and carefully examined the collar. Concealed beneath the inner lining, covered in dust and dirt, was a metal tag, dented, almost illegible. He strained his eyes under the porch light. A few digits, a jumbled chip ID. Someone had attempted to obliterate it, to hide it. That same night, Eli drove to the other side of town to see Mara, a retired veterinary technician and one of a few individuals he trusted. She resided on a farm, surrounded by rescued animals and incomplete art projects. She refrained from asking many questions, which was precisely what Eli required. Under her scanner, the chip emitted a faint signal. The system took longer than anticipated. But then, something emerged. A name, a partial history. Sarge, Marlowe whispered. That was his name. Owned by. She paused, scrolling. Private. The days felt more acute now, as if the wind possessed an edge. Eli couldn't shake the unease that crept beneath his skin since the reporter's telephone call. He was uncertain whether to trust her. Yet, something in her voice, calm, factual, laden with a hidden weight, persisted in his thoughts. She had spoken like someone unsurprised, someone who knew precisely the kind of obscurity that lay behind the term classified. He began his mornings early, pacing the yard with a mug of black coffee while Sarge, Shadow, as he now started to call him, patrolled the perimeter in silent vigilance. The dog moved with methodical exactitude, inspecting the same locations each day, never dawdling, never sidetracked. Eli did not instruct him. He didn't need to. It was already ingrained in him, deeply instilled. But it wasn't merely a habit. It was defense, protection, apprehension. That afternoon, Eli delved into his old military connections, finally telephoning a man he hadn't communicated with in 5 years. Colonel Reeves, a now-retired intelligence officer who owed him a favor. They convened at a quiet drinking establishment on the town's periphery. Reeves arrived wearing a windbreaker, hands in his pockets, his gaze keen even in retirement. Eli slid the damaged chip number across the table. "Where did you acquire this?" Reeves inquired. "In a dog collar." Reeves arched an eyebrow. "Military? Private?" "He came from an auction. I wasn't seeking trouble." Reeves didn't touch the piece of paper. He simply stared at it for an extended period, then finally mumbled, "Some of these contracts, they weren't official government operations. Some of the missions weren't meant to be recalled." "What are you implying?" "I mean, if that dog was involved in the kind of mission I suspect, then someone desired his disappearance. Dogs don't just materialize at rural auctions, Eli. Not dogs like that." That night, back at the house, Eli found sleep elusive. Shadow had taken to sleeping near the front entrance, always positioning himself between Eli and the exterior world. At 2 a.m., Eli was seated at the kitchen table, leafing through an old notebook, when Shadow abruptly lifted his head and growled. A low, deep, and unfamiliar sound. Eli's body tensed. The growl was not for show. Shadow was now fully alert, pacing towards the front window. Eli cautiously stepped beside him, parting the curtain. A black sedan was parked just across the field. No lights, no movement, merely idling. Then, slowly, it reversed and vanished down the road. Shadow continued to stare for a considerable time. Eli felt his heart pounding in his throat. He secured every door and double-checked the windows. Someone had come, observed, and departed. But why? Why now? The following morning, he gathered Shadow's bedding and relocated it to his bedroom. No more doors separated them, no more space. Shadow seemed unconcerned. He curled up near the foot of the bed without a sound, as if he had already been anticipating that alteration. And something within Eli changed as well. This was no longer solely about a traumatized dog. This was about a connection, a warning, a past that neither of them could keep suppressed any longer. Whatever had befallen Shadow in the deserts of some forsaken conflict zone, whoever had attempted to obliterate it, they had not succeeded. Because now Eli knew, and he was not going to cease his investigation. The weather changed that week. An early cold front arrived, covering the town in frost and stillness. Each morning, Eli awoke before dawn, his breath visible in the dim kitchen light. And every morning, Shadow was already by the door, prepared, attentive, observing. Their routine had become like clockwork. Silent excursions, long drives, quiet meals. The quietness between them had evolved into something hallowed. Neither required words to comprehend the other. Yet, despite the tranquility, something within Eli began to stir, a memory, a weight, the kind of pressure that accumulates not from sound but from its absence. His own nightmares had started to resurface, more vivid, more brutal, the explosion, the sand in his mouth, the blood, and the final image of his former K9 partner disappearing into smoke as he cried for assistance. Eli had suppressed those memories for years, burying them beneath distractions and arduous labor. But now, with Shadow in the house, they were seeping back through the fissures. One evening, following a particularly lengthy walk through the frozen woods, Eli stumbled inside, collapsed into his recliner, and reached for his bottle of pain medication. He had been without it for some time, but the headaches had returned, the cold made everything ache. He took 2 pills and closed his eyes. What he was unaware of was that across the road, his elderly neighbor, Miss Margaret, had slipped in her garden and fallen near the back gate. The frost on the ground bit into her skin, and her calls for help were scarcely louder than a whisper. No one was nearby. No one heard her except Shadow. The dog jolted awake from his position by the bed. Something had registered in his senses, something beyond mere hearing. He ran to the front door, growling softly. When Eli didn't respond, lost in the stupor of pills and fatigue, Shadow did something he had never done before. He lunged. The screen door splintered under his impact, and he raced into the night. Eli awoke to the sound of barking, loud and frantic. Disoriented, he staggered to his feet, his heart pounding. He followed the sound across the yard, flashlight wavering in his hand. What he discovered took his breath away. Shadow was standing beside Miss Margaret's still form, barking incessantly, attempting to lick her face, to nudge her into consciousness. The woman was barely awake, her skin pale, her lips trembling. Eli dropped beside her, checked her pulse, and dialed 911. The paramedics arrived just in time. Hypothermia had begun to take hold. A few more minutes and she might not have survived. The following day, the local newspaper featured a brief article, "Veteran's Dog Rescues Elderly Woman from Near Fatal Fall." The byline belonged to Clara, the same reporter who had previously contacted him about Shadow. This time, however, she didn't wish to discuss private security companies or erase data. She brought something different, a photograph. It was old, perhaps 5 years. It depicted a younger man in military attire kneeling beside a German shepherd that bore a striking resemblance to Shadow. The background was unmistakable: desert sand, chain-link fencing, armed guards. The caption was partially torn, but one name was still visible: Logan Price. Clara tapped the photograph gently. "This man, he's missing. Declared killed in action 3 years ago, but no body was ever recovered. And the last time anyone saw him, he had a dog, one that looks exactly like yours." Eli remained silent for a considerable time. If this was accurate, if Logan hadn't perished, and if Shadow had once belonged to him, then the narrative wasn't merely about a traumatized canine. It concerned a vanished individual, a concealed operation, and a silence dense with secrets. Eli looked down at Shadow, who sat at his feet, tail still, eyes fixed on the door as if anticipating someone's arrival. There was more to unearth. The trail was not yet cold. The next morning, frost still clung to the window panes like an omen. Eli arose early, but Shadow was already positioned at the door, his posture rigid, tail motionless, ears erect. Something had put him on edge again. Eli opened the door slowly, anticipating nothing more than the wind. But just beyond the porch, partially concealed beneath the welcome mat, lay a sealed envelope. No postage, no addressee, simply placed there with intent. Eli stared at it for a moment before retrieving it. His hands felt colder than the surrounding air. He walked to the table, tore it open, and extracted a single photograph and a note. The photograph was identical to the one Clara had shown. Logan kneeling beside Shadow in full tactical attire. This time, however, the image was clearer, sharper, and taken from a higher vantage point, almost like surveillance footage. Eli turned it over. Inscribed in black ink were the words, "Some dogs aren't meant to come home." The note contained nothing further. He leaned back in the chair, his heart thumping. His skin tingled, not merely from fear, but from anger. Someone had been observing. Someone knew his location, his identity, what he possessed. The photograph was not just a warning. It was a directive. Later that day, Eli departed for town, taking his time at the store, attempting to behave normally, trying not to feel as though he were being followed. But upon his return home, the front door was slightly ajar. He froze on the steps. Inside, drawers were open, files disarranged. Nothing of monetary value was missing except for one item: Shadow's old collar, the same one Eli had removed weeks prior, the one with the damaged chip, the only tangible proof linking the dog to a past someone clearly wished to obliterate. Eli telephoned Clara. She answered on the second ring, and he didn't mince words. They've been here. He detailed everything, the photo, the note, the break-in. Clara was silent for a moment, then whispered, I believe you're in deeper than you realize. She pledged to investigate further, but Eli already felt the burden of it settling upon his shoulders. He didn't know their identity. Contractor. The cabin transformed into a refuge, constructed from shadows and quietude. Days went by in a haze of vigilance. Eli maintained a low fire and kept the doors secured, only stepping outside for water from the nearby stream and tinned provisions he had stored there years before. Yet, even as apprehension lingered just below the surface, something different began to flourish between man and dog. Trust, more profound and genuine than any Eli had experienced in years. Shadow never strayed from his side. He trailed Eli from one room to another, reacting not to directives, but to presence. At night, they would sit in the subdued glow of the fireplace, Eli drinking weak coffee and Shadow, resting his head on Eli's boot, his breathing slow and even, as if he finally grasped the feeling of safety. It was on the 5th night that the call arrived. Clara's voice crackled through the interference, sharp with urgency. Eli, I've discovered something, she stated. You're not going to credit it. She emailed a scan document, an old military file, heavily redacted, pieced together from whistleblower disclosures and archive records. The name Logan Price was at the top alongside a code name, Project Echo Watch, a covert operations unit disavowed by the government, privately financed, operating in the ambiguous zone between lawful and unlawful. Attached to the file was a second photograph, one Eli hadn't encountered previously. It showed Logan, clearly injured, his arm in a sling, being led by Shadow through a dusty evacuation area. In the corner, a timestamp indicated a date nearly a year after Logan had supposedly been declared deceased. Clara spoke softly. Eli, he didn't perish in that mission. He survived. There were rumors about a rogue handler who vanished following an ambush, someone who possessed too much information. I believe Logan went into hiding. Eli stared at the screen. Where would he go? I don't know, Clara replied. But I found something peculiar. A series of minor veterinary visits across 3 states, each under a different pseudonym. Same breed, same limp, same scar beneath the ear. And the most recent one was near a coastal town 4 hours south of you. Eli didn't pause. He loaded the truck. Shadow leaped into the back seat as if he already knew their destination. They drove through the night. The road seemed longer than usual, every passing mile fraught with uncertainty. Eli was unsure what he would discover, but deep down he believed Logan was alive. And if Shadow had been attempting to guide him somewhere, perhaps this was it. They arrived in the town just after sunrise, a drowsy place by the docks, weathered and time-worn, where fishermen hauled their nets and no one posed too many inquiries. Eli began at the veterinary clinic mentioned in the records, then proceeded from one shelter to another, displaying Logan's photograph to anyone who would stop long enough to look. Most individuals shrugged. One remarked that he looked vaguely familiar. Another gestured towards the docks, and that's where it transpired. As Eli walked along the harbor's edge, Shadow suddenly stopped, his ears erect, nose twitching. Then, without warning, he darted down the pier, weaving between crates and nets, until he halted before a man hunched beneath a worn hoodie. The man turned slowly, his face partly obscured by the sun. Eli's heart caught in his throat. The man dropped to his knees. Shadow didn't bark, didn't lunge. He stepped forward and rested his head against the man's chest. The man exhaled shakily and buried his hands in Shadow's fur. When he looked up, Eli saw everything in his eyes. Pain, recognition, disbelief. Logan, he whispered. The man nodded. I thought you were dead. I was meant to be. And in that instant, the silence shattered. Not the kind that reverberated through combat zones, but the kind that arose from 2 fractured souls comprehending they were no longer solitary in their struggle for remembrance. For an extended moment, neither of them uttered a word. Eli stood a short distance away, allowing the scene to permeate his senses. Shadow nestled into Logan's chest, both of them breathing as if the surrounding world had ceased to exist. It was as though time had collapsed upon itself, reversing years of quietude and unresolved queries. Shadow hadn't merely located his handler. He had rediscovered his purpose. And Logan, his eyes hollow, face partly scarred, posture stooped from isolation, appeared like a man who had finally been granted permission to draw breath. When Logan eventually rose, his voice was brittle, like dry timber. "I never imagined I'd see him again. Or anyone." Eli nodded slowly. He waited. All this time, he waited. They sat by the water's edge, conversing in fragments, pieces of the past coalescing like slowly reassembled broken glass. Logan recounted the mission that had gone awry, the ambush that was never supposed to occur, the betrayal that had left his unit abandoned. Shadow had dragged him through sand and fire to safety, refusing to depart even when the evacuation team arrived. But once Logan was airlifted out and designated presumed dead, everything else unraveled. There was no one to claim the dog, no one to advocate for him. "I couldn't return," Logan stated. "They would have silenced me. I possessed too much information. I witnessed too much, and I couldn't risk him becoming entangled in that again." So he vanished, altered his name, relocated from one place to another, observing the news from the periphery. But when Clara's article eventually emerged, and Shadow's rescue made headlines, he knew it was time. They journeyed back to Eli's cabin together, Logan occupying the passenger seat this time, Shadow stretched out between them. The atmosphere was quiet but not strained. It was the kind of silence earned only through shared suffering. In the ensuing weeks, Clara collaborated tirelessly with her editor to assemble the complete narrative. The exposé struck digital media like a thunderbolt. The Forgotten Dog, a K-9's escape from the war they tried to erase. Within hours, it went viral. Major news networks picked up the story. Veterans from all over the nation voiced their support. Donations flooded in to aid retired service dogs. And most significantly, the truth they had endeavored to conceal, was finally brought to light. Eli and Logan were summoned to testify before a special congressional committee investigating the supervision of private military contractors. They stood side by side in that frigid, echoing chamber with Shadow at their feet. Older now, slightly grizzled around the muzzle, but dignified, serene. The kind of composure that accompanies the completion of a mission. When Eli was questioned about why he had taken the dog home that day, his voice remained steady. "Because he looked like he'd already endured hell. And I understood what that felt like." Logan added softly, "He saved my life once, and then he saved it again by finding Eli." The committee paused in silence. No barrage of questions, no refutations, just acknowledgement. Months later, back in the small coastal town, Logan established a modest therapy center for veterans and their service animals. Eli assisted in designing the program, integrating canine rescue with rehabilitation for wounded soldiers. They named the center Echo Watch, not as a commemoration of the project that had failed them, but as a pledge that their stories would no longer resonate in silence. Shadow became the custodian of that establishment. He welcomed every new veteran with a gentle nudge, guided apprehensive hands to trust anew, and lay beside those who still awoke screaming in the dead of night. He didn't need to speak. His presence sufficed, a reminder that healing stems not from forgetting, but from remembering alongside someone who comprehends. On the wall inside the center's main room hangs a framed photograph. Logan, Eli, and Shadow, all standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the inscription. He wasn't just rescued, he rescued us all. And every so often, as the sun dips below the ocean beyond the therapy yard, Shadow rises from his preferred spot, walks to the gate, and gazes towards the horizon, as if awaiting one final soldier to find their way home.